Close your eyes and drift back through time. Imagine a world without electricity, without the glow of street lamps, without the hum of cars or the buzz of screens. Instead, there is only the soft crackle of a fire, the hollow clatter of wooden cartwheels, and the distant toll of a church bell echoing across a valley. This is medieval Europe, a world that stretched over centuries, from the 5th to the 15th, shaping countless lives within its fields, villages, and castles. For nearly 1,000 years, life was guided not by the rush of machines or technology, but by the rhythms of the natural world. The rising of the sun called people from their straw beds. The ringing of bells marked hours of prayer, work, and rest. The cycle of the seasons dictated when fields were sown, when they were harvested, and when people feasted or went hungry. Step into this time and you would notice the stillness first. A world without engines or electricity feels quieter, but also heavier. The air is full of natural sounds. Roosters crowing, the wind through the trees, the bleating of sheep, the shuffle of feet along dirt roads. In small villages, life clustered tightly around narrow lanes of mud, where cottages of timber and thatch leaned against one another, their walls patched with clay. Chickens pecked in the filth beneath the windows. Pigs and goats wandered through the same paths as the villagers themselves. Inside the cottages, life was even simpler. A single smoky fire warmed the room and blackened the rafters. Smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof, but much of it lingered, stinging the eyes. Beds were made of straw or hay, laid on wooden frames or simply on the ground. At night, families often huddled together for warmth. The walls of the home were thin, and drafts seeped through the cracks, carrying in the bite of winter winds. For us, coming from the modern world, it is hard to imagine the absence of the things we consider essential. There was no clean running water, no way to simply twist a tap and fill a glass. Fetching water meant walking to a well, sometimes shared by the entire village, and carrying it in heavy wooden buckets. There was no hot bath waiting at the end of the day. Washing, when it happened, was often done in cold rivers or streams, and sometimes not at all. Food, too, was nothing like the variety we know. For the poor, a meal might be little more than dark bread, a thin porridge, or a weak ale. Fresh fruit and vegetables were seasonal and scarce. Meat was rare, a luxury reserved for feasts or for the wealthy. And when winter stretched long, meals grew smaller and hunger sharper. To us, with our supermarkets full of abundance, it would feel like deprivation. But to them, it was simply life. The air itself would feel different. Towns and villages smelled of earth, smoke, and animals. In summer, the scent of dung and sweat was everywhere. In winter, the cold stung the lungs, and fires filled homes with acrid smoke. Yet for those who lived then, this was the familiar rhythm of existence. For us, stepping into it, even for a single day, it would be overwhelming. Still, there was beauty, too. Fields of barley swaying beneath the sun. Great forests, vast and deep, where wolves and boars still roamed. Rivers flowing steadily, their waters carrying life to the villages along their banks. Above it all, the silence of starry nights, undisturbed by the glow of modern cities. People of the Middle Ages lived closer to the rhythms of the earth than we do now. Every sunrise, every harvest, every winter frost carried meaning. Yet it is important to remember, they did not see themselves as primitive. They were simply living as their parents had and as their children would. Their homes, rough though they seem to us, were the center of their world. Their work, though exhausting, was their survival. Their faith, their festivals, their songs, and their stories gave life meaning in a way that made the hardships bearable. And so, as we begin this journey into the past, imagine yourself stepping into their shoes. Picture walking through a village at dawn, the mist still clinging to the fields. Hear the distant toll of the church bell calling people to morning prayer. Smell the smoke of fires kindling for the day's meals. See children carrying buckets of water, women kneading coarse dough, men readying their tools for the fields. This is the stage on which all of medieval life was set. A world without our comforts, without our medicine, without our safety nets. For them, it was the only world they knew. For us, accustomed to warmth, convenience, and choice, it would be almost impossible to endure. And that is why, as we journey deeper into this world, we will see why you and I, and nearly anyone from the modern age, could not survive even a week in medieval Europe. For now, rest with the image of that quiet village, a smoky hearth, a muddy lane, a bell tolling in the distance. This is where the story begins. Imagine for a moment that you wake in a small medieval village. The morning mist still clings to the fields, and the church bell has just tolled, summoning people to begin their day. You decide to leave your home and walk to the next settlement, perhaps to visit a market, to see a family member, or to deliver a message. Today, such a journey would be trivial. A short drive on paved roads, a quick trip by train, or even a bus ride would carry you swiftly and safely. But in the Middle Ages, this simple choice, stepping beyond the boundaries of your village, was to set out on something long, exhausting, and often dangerous. Travel was not impossible, but it was difficult in ways we can hardly imagine. The roads, if they existed at all, were little more than muddy tracks cut through the countryside. In the best of weather, they were uneven and rutted, difficult for carts or wagons. After rain, they turned into swamps of thick mud, swallowing wheels and shoes alike. In winter, they froze hard, becoming treacherous sheets of ice. There were no smooth cobblestones stretching for miles, no neat signs to guide the way. Paths forked and vanished into forests, leaving travelers to guess or follow local knowledge. If you were wealthy, you might own a horse, a mule, or a sturdy cart. But most people, the vast majority, walked. Journeys were measured not in hours, but in days, sometimes weeks. A trip of 10 or 15 miles could take an entire day on foot, especially when carrying loads of goods or leading livestock. And unlike the endless choices we have today, cars, trains, airplanes, your body was your transport. Every step, every ache in your legs, every blister on your feet was part of the journey. And the journey was rarely safe. Bandits haunted the roads, lurking in forests or hidden in ravines, waiting for travelers who carried coins, cloth, or grain. To be robbed was not just a loss of money, it could mean hunger, ruin, or worse. For this reason, people often traveled in groups, walking together for safety, or joining merchant caravans when they could. Lone travelers, unless they were armed and confident, were easy prey. Even without the threat of violence, the land itself made travel exhausting. Dense forests stretched across much of Europe, dark and thick, filled with wolves, bears, and wild boars. Swamps and marshes sucked at boots and wagons. Rivers crossed the land like great obstacles, and bridges were rare. Most crossings were shallow fords, and in times of rain or flood, they became deadly traps. A swollen river could sweep away a person, a horse, even an entire cart. Imagine the sheer effort of moving goods. Imagine you were a farmer bringing grain to a market 10 miles away. You load your sacks onto a cart, if you were lucky enough to own one, or more likely, you sling them across your back. The road is rough. The air is hot and heavy. Flies buzz around your face, and the weight presses on your shoulders. By the time you arrive, your clothes are soaked with sweat, your hands blistered, your feet raw. And then you must make the return journey home. For nobles and kings, travel was no simple matter either. A lord or lady, traveling to another estate, brought with them not only their horse or carriage, but also an entourage, servants, guards, and animals. Moving such a group was slow and costly. Roads could not bear the weight of grand wagons, and the entire procession crept forward at the pace of its slowest cart. Even royal progressions, which sound grand in storybooks, were tiring affairs that took days to move a short distance. And always, there was the weather. A summer journey meant dust rising from the road, clinging to your clothes, filling your lungs. A winter journey meant bitter winds cutting through woolen cloaks, freezing hands and feet until they burned with pain. Rain turned tracks into rivers of mud, and snow made paths vanish altogether. To travel was to risk exhaustion, illness, or death from exposure. Yet people did travel because they had to. Merchants carried goods between towns, pilgrims walked to distant shrines, some trudging across all of Europe on faith alone. Messengers rode with news, passing letters from one lord to another. Soldiers marched to battles far from home. And peasants, though most lived their lives within a day's walk of their birthplace, sometimes ventured out to markets, fairs, or in search of work. But let us not mistake necessity for ease. For us, leaving home for a short trip is often a matter of comfort. We pack a bag, step into a vehicle, and arrive without difficulty. For them, leaving home was a risk, a hardship, and sometimes a desperate gamble. Imagine now that you are on such a road. The forest looms on either side. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of pine and earth. Your shoes are worn thin, and the mud clings to them, pulling with each step. You hear a sound in the distance, the rustle of movement, perhaps just a deer, perhaps something more. You tighten your cloak, look down the path ahead, and see only more trees, stretching endlessly. You walk on, one foot after another, because there is no choice. And this is why travel, something we take for granted today, would be one of the first great challenges you would face in medieval Europe. The exhaustion, the danger, the endless time it consumed, it was not a luxury, but a test of endurance. For someone from the modern world, accustomed to smooth highways and trains that carry us swiftly across nations, such journeys would feel unbearable. And so, if you were to live a week in medieval Europe, it would not take long before the difficulty of moving even a few miles wore you down. Roads were rough, journeys were long, and safety was never guaranteed. Travel in the Middle Ages was not just movement, it was survival. As the church bell tolls once again in the distance, calling the villagers to prayer, you return in thought to the comfort of the cottage you left behind. Already, you feel the ache in your feet, the heaviness of your cloak, the weight of the road pressing down. Tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, the roads will remain muddy, uneven, and endless. This was the harsh reality of travel in medieval Europe, and it is one more reason why you would not last a week in this world. At the end of a long day in medieval Europe, When the fields had been worked, the animals tended, and the church bell had rung its evening call, the villagers returned to their homes. One might think that rest would bring comfort, that sleep would arrive easily after such exhausting labor. But for most people, the reality of sleeping in the Middle Ages was far removed from the warmth and softness we know today. Close your eyes and imagine stepping into a peasant's cottage. The floor is packed earth, hard beneath your feet. Smoke drifts lazily from the central hearth, stinging your eyes and clinging to your clothes. In one corner lies the sleeping space, not a bed as we know it, but a rough wooden frame filled with straw, hay, or reeds. The straw is old, flattened by use, and alive with insects, fleas, lice, and bedbugs that bite through the night. The blanket is a coarse woolen sheet, heavy but never quite enough to keep out the cold. For the poorest, even this was a luxury. Some slept on bare straw, strewn across the floor, covered by a cloak or nothing at all. Families often shared these spaces. Parents, children, sometimes even servants and animals crowded together for warmth. Privacy, as we understand it, was rare. The body heat of many people together helped fight the chill, but it also meant rest was disturbed by coughing, snoring, and the cries of infants. And there was always the cold. In winter, cottages offered little protection. Walls of wattle and daub cracked easily, and winds crept through every gap. A single fire in the hearth might glow through the night, but it filled the air with smoke that made breathing heavy. If the fire burned low, frost gathered on the inside of walls, and the straw beds stiffened with ice. To us, used to warm duvets and central heating, the experience would be harsh, even unbearable. Even in castles, where nobility lived, comfort was far from modern standards. A lord's bed might be grand, with carved wood and heavy curtains, but the mattress was still stuffed with straw or feathers, which grew musty and lumpy over time. Curtains were not only decorative, they served to trap heat, turning the bed into a small, warm chamber against the drafty stone of the hall. Servants sometimes slept on the floor nearby, wrapped in cloaks. Despite the grandeur of tapestries and cushions, the stone walls were cold and the air often damp. The rhythm of sleep itself was different from ours. Without electric light, nights stretched long and dark, especially in winter. Many medieval people experienced what is now called segmented sleep. They went to bed soon after sunset, rose for an hour or two in the middle of the night to pray, stoke the fire, or even visit neighbors, and then returned to bed for a second sleep until dawn. To us, this broken pattern might feel unnatural. To them, it was part of life. And then, of course, there were the pests. Fleas and lice were constant companions, carried by people, animals, and bedding alike. Rats scurried in corners, attracted by food scraps. The bite of a flea in the night might not seem fatal, but in an age where plague could spread through the bite of a flea or the scurry of a rat, even these small annoyances carried danger. To live and sleep in such conditions was to accept constant discomfort. Think for a moment of how precious sleep feels to us now. We seek quiet bedrooms, soft pillows, clean sheets, and mattresses built for comfort. We seal our windows against the cold, and we darken our rooms with curtains. In the Middle Ages, none of this was possible. Sleep was never entirely safe, never entirely clean, never entirely peaceful. Picture yourself lying down in such a cottage. The straw beneath you crackles with movement. Something tickles at your ankle. It may be a flea, it may be a mouse. The blanket scratches against your skin, rough wool that smells faintly of sheep. The air is smoky, your throat dry from the fire. Beside you, a child stirs, a neighbor snores, and outside the wind rattles the shutters. You try to rest, but the cold creeps in, and the night feels endless. And yet, rest was essential. The peasant needed strength to rise before dawn and work the fields again. The craftsman needed steady hands for labor at the bench. The nobleman needed clarity to judge disputes or lead his household. Sleep came because it had to, because the body demanded it, even when the bed was hard, the air foul, and the night filled with noise. In some towns, inns offered lodging for travelers, but these were crowded places. Beds were shared by strangers, sometimes 2 or 3 to a mattress. The cost was high for the poor, and the risk of theft or disease was ever present. To rest in an inn was rarely restful. So, whether in a peasant's hut, a town inn, or a noble's chamber, sleep in the Middle Ages was a battle against cold, insects, and discomfort. Only the wealthiest, with feather beds, thick furs, and servants to tend fires through the night, enjoyed something close to comfort. For most, rest was simply a pause between one day's labor and the next. And for us, stepping into this world, a single night would test our endurance. The itch of straw, the smoke of the fire, the chill of the air, the noise of animals and neighbors, it would strip away the peace we associate with bedtime. One night would be tiring. A week would be unbearable. So, as you imagine yourself drifting into such a bed, remember, the Middle Ages offered little softness. Rest came not from comfort, but from necessity. To sleep in medieval Europe was to close your eyes and endure the night, no matter what came with it. When you imagine life in medieval Europe, you may think of grand feasts in castle halls, tables groaning beneath roasted meats, goblets of wine, and musicians playing softly while nobles dine. And yes, such feasts did exist, but they were rare, reserved for the wealthiest and for special occasions. For most people, day-to-day food was far simpler, far humbler, and often far less satisfying. Picture yourself waking in a small village, the dawn bell ringing across frosty fields. Before work begins, a simple meal must be taken. For peasants, this was usually bread. Dark, heavy bread made from rye, barley, or oats. It was coarse, sometimes sour, and often mixed with other ingredients like beans or acorns when grain was scarce. The bread was filling but dense, more a tool for survival than a pleasure. Alongside it, there might be a weak ale or watered-down wine, for clean water was difficult to find. Milk was not common for adults, for much of it went to making cheese or butter, and fresh fruit or vegetables were only eaten when they were in season. Imagine biting into a piece of this bread, chewy, rough on the teeth, flavored faintly by the smoke of the hearth where it had been baked. It fills the stomach, but it does not bring joy. For the midday meal, peasants relied heavily on pottage, a thick stew that could contain almost anything at hand. Barley, peas, onions, cabbage, and beans simmered slowly in a single pot. Sometimes, if luck allowed, a piece of salted pork, a small fish, or a handful of herbs might be added. But meat was rare, far too expensive for daily meals. The stew was ladled out into wooden bowls, eaten with spoons carved from wood or horn. There was little variety, but it was nourishing enough to give strength for the endless work in the fields. Nobles ate differently, though their diets were not always healthier. In castle kitchens, cooks prepared bread from wheat flour, lighter and whiter than the rough loaves of peasants. They roasted beef, pork, or venison, flavored with spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves, luxuries imported at great cost. Salt was precious too, for it preserved meats through the long winters. Sweet pastries and pies sometimes appeared, filled with fruit or nuts. But while the tables of the rich looked impressive, balance was not their strength. Meals were heavy with meat and fat, and vegetables were often neglected. For the church, food carried spiritual meaning. Days of fasting were frequent, sometimes more than 100 in a year. On these days, meat was forbidden and fish took its place. Across towns and villages, rivers and ponds were stocked, and fishing became an important trade. In monasteries, monks ate simply, bread, fish, beans, and ale, while avoiding indulgence. But even within fasting, loopholes were found. A beaver, for example, was sometimes classified as a fish because it lived in water and so its meat could be eaten on fast days. The seasons shaped the diet more than choice ever could. In spring, people might have fresh greens, leeks, and eggs from hens. Summer brought berries, cherries, and peas. Autumn was a time of harvest, apples, nuts, and preserved fruits. Winter, however, was a season of hunger. Stores of grain grew low, vegetables shriveled, and salted meats grew tougher and saltier with each passing week. Many peasants went to bed with stomachs half full, waiting for spring to bring fresh food again. Think of how we eat now. We expect fruit year-round, fresh vegetables in every season, and meat available at a moment's notice. The medieval world offered none of this. Your diet was dictated by where you lived, what the land could grow, and whether the harvest had been kind. A poor harvest meant hunger, and hunger could last for months. Meals themselves were different in structure. There was no concept of breakfast, lunch, and dinner as we know them. Instead, peasants ate two main meals, one in the late morning, after hours of work, and one in the evening, after the fields were done. The timing followed the rhythm of the sun and the church bells, not the clock. Drinks were rarely water alone. Wells and rivers were easily contaminated, so weak ale, cider, or watered-down wine was the safer choice. Even children drank ale, though it was mild. Monks brewed beer in monasteries, and it became an important staple across Europe. To drink water was sometimes seen as risky, even unhealthy, unless it came from a clean spring. Spices were a mark of wealth. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, these came from faraway lands, carried over deserts and seas by merchants. To own them was to show status, for they cost dearly. Some nobles even overspiced their dishes, using more pepper than the taste demanded simply to display their riches. For peasants, the spice was salt, if they could afford it, and the herbs that grew nearby, parsley, sage, or thyme. Imagine yourself seated at one of these meals. If you were in a cottage, the pottage in your bowl is lukewarm, flavored by onions and cabbage, with perhaps a scrap of meat floating in it. The bread you dip into it is rough and hard. If you are in a castle, your table holds a roasted boar, a pie filled with minced meat and dried fruits, and goblets of red wine. But even here, the hall is smoky, the food rich to the point of heaviness, and forks are still unknown. Only knives and spoons guide the meal. For travelers, inns along the road provided food, but quality was uncertain.
A bowl of broth, a hunk of bread, and perhaps a piece of dried fish were set before you. The taste was secondary. Survival was the goal. Hunger softened complaints, and most meals were eaten quickly before the fire, with strangers all around. To live in medieval Europe was to accept a diet shaped by necessity, season, and status. Rarely was there choice. Rarely was there excess. Food filled the body, but it rarely delighted the senses. Hunger was a constant shadow, never far away. And for us, stepping into that world, a single week of such eating would wear on us. The lack of variety, the scarcity of fresh fruits and vegetables, the endless repetition of bread and pottage would leave us weary, craving the comforts we now take for granted. So, as you imagine sitting by the hearth, a wooden bowl in your hands, consider the truth. Food in the Middle Ages was not a pleasure, but a necessity. To eat was to endure, just as to sleep was to endure. Life itself was built upon endurance, day after day, year after year. When we think of medieval Europe, one of the first ideas that often comes to mind is poor hygiene. And it is true, cleanliness was far from what we consider normal today. But the story is more layered than the old myths of people never bathing at all. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was shaped by limited resources, superstition, and necessity. And for anyone stepping into that world, the difference would be felt immediately, in every sense: sight, smell, and touch. Imagine walking into a village at the height of summer. The air is heavy with the scent of animals, smoke, and unwashed bodies. The streets are narrow, often little more than dirt paths, and waste, both human and animal, finds its way onto the ground. Chamber pots are emptied into the street, where dogs and pigs rummage. Rain washes it away. but in dry weather, the stench lingers. Water was central to hygiene, but its use depended on access. In towns, public bathhouses once flourished, especially during the earlier Middle Ages. People paid a small fee to enter, soaking in hot tubs or washing in warm water. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, sometimes together, and for a time these bathhouses were part of normal urban life. But over the centuries, suspicion grew. Concerns about immorality, disease, and sin led to their decline. By the later Middle Ages, many had closed, and the practice of regular bathing fell out of fashion. In villages, people relied on rivers, ponds, or wells. Washing in a river could be refreshing, but it was also risky, for the same river might carry waste from upstream. Wells provided cleaner water, but drawing and heating enough for a bath was a heavy task. More often, people washed their hands and faces, sometimes their feet, but rarely their whole bodies. Full body baths might be taken only a few times a year, often on religious festivals. Instead of bathing, people turned to linen. It was common to change underclothes when possible, for linen absorbed sweat and dirt. Washing clothes in rivers or tubs was an important part of keeping clean, though the task was tiring and time-consuming. For nobles, scented oils, powders, and perfumes helped mask odors. For peasants, smoke from the hearth clung to their clothes, blending with the smells of labor. Teeth received little care. Toothbrushes as we know them did not exist, though people sometimes used cloths, twigs, or herbs to clean their mouths. Bad teeth were common, and pain was frequent. Dentistry was rudimentary, with extractions done by barbers or local healers. A toothache, once it began, could last for months. Hair was another matter. Lice were ever present, and knit combs, fine-toothed combs of bone or wood, were used to manage them. Shaving was not common for most men, but hair was trimmed when it grew too wild. Monks shaved their crowns in a style called the tonsure, while nobles might employ barbers. Women often covered their hair with veils, wimples, or headscarves, which kept it cleaner and hid the tangles. Hands were washed before meals, especially among the wealthy, since eating was done with fingers. Water was poured from jugs into basins, and towels were offered. This was both a matter of etiquette and of necessity. Yet even with such practices, the spread of illness was inevitable. With no knowledge of germs, hygiene was not seen as a shield against disease, but as a matter of appearance and ritual. Smell was inescapable. Imagine yourself living in this world. The scent of animals is constant. Horses, pigs, chickens, and goats, all nearby. Smoke fills the home from the hearth fire. The streets carry the odor of waste. Bodies unwashed for weeks carry their own musk. Perfume or herbs may soften it, but only for the few who could afford them. To us, accustomed to daily showers and clean clothes, the sensation would be overwhelming. Monasteries, however, stood apart. Monks valued cleanliness, not always for health, but for discipline. They bathed more often than laypeople, sometimes weekly, sometimes more during certain holy days. They washed their hands and faces before prayer. In these enclosed communities, water management was more organized, with lavatories and washhouses built into the cloisters. Yet even here, standards would fall short of our expectations. For women, hygiene carried additional burdens. Managing menstruation was difficult without modern cloths or products. Rags, moss, or simple cloth were used, washed when possible. Childbirth, too, was risky and unsanitary, with few tools to prevent infection. The natural rhythms of the body were endured with little relief. And then there were the outbreaks of plague and disease. When illness spread, people sometimes avoided water, believing that it opened the pores to harmful air. Bathing, once common in towns, became associated with sickness. Instead, fumigation, burning herbs, carrying posies of flowers, or wearing scented sachets was thought to protect against the invisible dangers of the air.
To wash less was, in their eyes, to stay safe. Think now of your own habits. A warm shower each morning, clean clothes pulled from a machine, toothpaste on a brush, soap foaming in your hands. These things are so natural we do not question them. In medieval Europe, none of this existed. Water was fetched by hand, soap was rare, and the idea of invisible germs had yet to be discovered. Hygiene was a patchwork of tradition, superstition, and necessity. If you were to live in that world, the adjustment would be severe. After one day, you would feel the grit of dirt on your skin. After two, the itch of sweat and fleas. After a week, the smell of smoke and unwashed bodies would cling to you, unavoidable. For them, it was simply life. For us, it would be unbearable. And yet, people endured. They married, worked, raised children, and carried on despite the grime. Their sense of cleanliness was shaped by what was possible, not by what was ideal. For them, this was not filth, it was normalcy. And so, the story of hygiene in the Middle Ages is not simply of dirt, but of resilience. So, as you imagine sitting by the hearth, a wooden bowl in your hands, consider the truth. A basin of water and a dimly lit room, a bar of coarse soap made from animal fat and ash, and the simple act of washing your hands before a meal. Small gestures, repeated through centuries, carried with them a sense of order and dignity.
It may not have been enough to meet our standards, but for them, it was enough to face each new day. Clothing in medieval Europe was more than just fabric stitched together. It was a mirror of status, survival, and tradition. What you wore told others who you were, where you came from, and even what you believed. Unlike today, when we change our outfits daily, medieval people often owned only a few garments, worn repeatedly, patched when torn, and handed down when old. To step into this world would mean wearing clothes that were practical, heavy, and far less comfortable than what we know today. Imagine beginning the day in a small village. A peasant man rises before dawn, pulling on his basic tunic. It is made of rough wool or linen, dyed in simple, muted colors like brown, gray, or faded green. The cloth is coarse, itchy against the skin, and often smells faintly of smoke from the hearth. Over it, he ties a belt of rope or leather, not for fashion but for usefulness, to hold tools or a pouch. His legs are covered with hose or simple trousers, patched many times. On his feet, leather shoes or boots, stiff and cracked, protect him only somewhat from the mud and cold. For a peasant woman, the outfit is similar in its plainness. A long dress or kirtle made from wool falls to the ankles, layered over a linen shift, which is the undergarment worn closest to the skin. Over her head, a wimple or scarf covers her hair, both as a mark of modesty and to keep dirt away. Aprons are tied on during work, stained from cooking or tending animals. For both men and women, clothing is rarely washed. Linen shifts may be changed more often, but outer garments, made of heavy wool, are worn for months without cleaning. Now, shift your imagination to a castle. Here, clothing takes on another meaning entirely. A nobleman's tunic is not coarse and plain but richly colored, dyed with expensive pigments. Deep reds, royal blues, and golden yellows are symbols of wealth, for the dyes themselves came from distant lands and cost dearly. His cloak is lined with fur, warm against the drafty stone walls. His shoes are pointed, made of fine leather, sometimes decorated with embroidery. Rings glitter on his fingers, and his belt is adorned with metalwork. Each piece tells a story of rank and fortune. For a noblewoman, clothing is both art and statement. Layers of fabric flow around her, an underdress, an overdress, and sometimes a surcoat draped elegantly over all. The gowns may be trimmed with fur, their sleeves trailing long and wide. A veil or headdress frames her face, and jewels may sparkle in her hair. These garments are heavy, sometimes weighing many pounds, and moving gracefully in them requires practice. Unlike the simple, practical wear of peasants, noble clothing announces presence before a word is spoken. Children, too, had clothing shaped by their place in society. Noble children were dressed as miniature versions of their parents, in tiny gowns or tunics, while peasant children often wore hand-me-downs, oversized until they grew into them. Clothing was precious, and nothing was wasted. Even rags could be rewoven, patched, or sold on. But beyond class, clothing also reflected rules of faith and law. The church preached modesty, urging men and women alike to cover their bodies. Sumptuary laws were introduced in some regions, restricting who could wear what. Certain furs, fabrics, or colors were reserved only for the highest ranks of nobility. For example, the rich purple dyes, once linked to emperors of Rome, remained a marker of high status centuries later. To wear them without right was a bold statement, and sometimes a punishable offense. The making of clothing itself was an arduous task. Wool had to be sheared from sheep, washed, carded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. Linen came from flax, pulled from fields, and laboriously processed before it could be sewn. Each stage took time, often weeks or months. For peasants, most garments were homemade or produced within the village. For nobles, skilled tailors and embroiderers created works of craft, their stitches hidden, their patterns intricate. A single dress for a wealthy lady might take months of labor. Clothing also offered protection. In the winter, peasants laddered woolen cloaks and hoods against the frost. In summer, linen shifts were lighter, though sweat quickly stained them. Armor was another kind of clothing altogether, reserved for knights and soldiers. Chains of mail, padded gambesons, and eventually plates of steel. To wear armor was to carry both protection and burden, for it was heavy, hot, and difficult to move in. Imagine yourself in these garments. As a peasant, your tunic scratches against your skin and the leather shoes rub at your heels. Your cloak smells of damp wool, never fully dry in the rainy season. As a noble, your gown is heavy and layered, beautiful but cumbersome, the fur lining warm yet suffocating in summer. Either way, comfort is not the aim. Function and appearance rule the day. Even small details reveal much. Buttons were rare at first, slowly introduced in the later Middle Ages. Before then, ties, laces, and brooches held clothing together. Belts carried knives, purses, or keys. Gloves, when owned, were symbols of refinement. Hats ranged from simple wool caps for peasants to tall hennons for noble women, those cone-shaped headdresses often seen in illustrations. Each item served to mark identity, whether plain or extravagant. For us today, clothing is abundant, changed daily, washed easily, and discarded often. In medieval Europe, it was treasured. A single cloak might last a lifetime. A tunic might be patched and worn until it fell apart. A gown might be handed down through generations. To own fine clothes was to hold wealth in fabric. And the smell, yes, the smell, was another reality. Without soap as we know it, without regular washing, garments carried the odors of sweat, smoke, and labor. Perfumes masked this for the wealthy, but only faintly. To us, used to clean cotton and freshly laundered fabrics, the sensation would be jarring. Clothing, then, was not just about covering the body. It was a language of survival, class, belief, and tradition. A peasant's wool tunic spoke of hard labor. A merchant's bright cloak declared success. A knight's armor shouted duty and danger. A lady's gown whispered wealth and lineage. If you were to step into medieval Europe, the first thing you would feel is the weight of fabric on your body, the itch of wool against your skin, the drag of garments not designed for ease, but for necessity or display. 1 week in such clothing, without the relief of light cottons, soft seams, or daily laundry, would wear on you. Yet for them, this was normal life. Clothing was not meant to make them comfortable. It was meant to place them within their world. In medieval Europe, life was defined by work. From dawn to dusk, nearly every man, woman, and child had tasks to complete. There was no escape from labor, no long stretches of leisure, and no promise of rest beyond the church's holy days. To survive, one had to work constantly for food, for shelter, for the simple endurance of life itself. Step into that world and you would feel the weight of work pressing upon you from the very first hour. Begin with the peasant. At the heart of medieval society was the farmer, who tilled the land not for profit, but for survival. Before the sun had risen, he was in the fields, guiding a wooden plow pulled by oxen, or sometimes even by his own strength. The soil was heavy, clumped with stones, and the tools were crude. His hands blistered, his back ached, but there was no choice. Without crops, there would be no bread. Without bread, there would be no life. The rhythm of the year determined the rhythm of his work. In spring, fields had to be plowed and seeds sown. In summer, weeds pulled and crops tended. In autumn, the harvest demanded endless hours of cutting, gathering, and threshing. In winter, the fields rested, but the work did not. Animals needed feeding, tools needed repairing, and firewood needed collecting. There was no true rest, only a change in the shape of labor. For the peasant woman, the work was just as unrelenting. She rose early to grind grain, bake bread, and prepare pottage for the family. She fetched water from the well, washed clothes by hand, and tended to children. In the fields, she worked beside her husband, bending to plant or reap. In the evenings, she spun thread, wove cloth, or repaired garments by the glow of the hearth. Her hands were always busy, her body always weary, her time never her own. Children were not spared. From the age of 5 or 6, they took on chores, scaring birds from crops, carrying water, gathering firewood. As they grew, they joined their parents in the fields, learning by doing, their games often little more than imitations of adult labor. Childhood, as we know it, barely existed. Life was training for work, and work was life. In towns, labor took on different forms. Craftsmen shaped wood, leather, or metal into goods. Blacksmiths hammered iron into nails, horseshoes, and tools. Weavers created cloth from threads, while shoemakers stitched leather into boots. Each craft had its guild, an association that set rules, prices, and standards. Apprenticeship was the path into these trades. A young boy, sometimes as early as 7, would be sent to live with the master, working long hours in exchange for food, lodging, and the promise of learning. The years were hard, the training strict, and only after many seasons could he hope to become a journeyman and eventually a master himself. Labor in towns was noisy, smoky, and constant. The clang of hammers, the smell of tanners' pits, the whir of spinning wheels all filled the air. Merchants added another layer of work, trading goods across regions, transporting cloth, wine, or salt by cart, ship, or caravan. Their lives were not spent in fields, but they carried their own hardships, long journeys, risks of robbery, and the uncertainty of markets. For the nobility, work looked different but was no less demanding. A lord oversaw his estate, judged disputes among his tenants, and ensured military readiness. His work was managing people, leading in battle, or fulfilling obligations to his king. A noble woman managed the household, directing servants, organizing stores of food, and ensuring hospitality for guests. Their labor was less physical, but it carried weight, political, social, and personal. And then there were those whose labor was spiritual. Monks and nuns lived by the rule of ora e labora, pray and work. Their days were divided by the bells of the monastery. Prayer at dawn, work in the fields or scriptorium by day, prayer again by night. They copied manuscripts by hand, tended gardens, brewed ale, and provided charity for the poor. Their labor was meant to honor God, but it was labor nonetheless, strict and unending. For all, the body bore the marks of work. Calloused hands, stooped backs, worn joints, these were the badges of survival. Injuries were common, whether from a misstep with a scythe, a fall from a ladder, or the constant strain of lifting. There were no machines to ease the burden, no labor laws to limit the hours, no doctors to heal the damage. The human body was the tool, and it was pushed to its limits. Think for a moment of your own daily life. Perhaps you work in a desk, or with tools, or with machines, but always with breaks, with food ready at hand, with shelter from the weather. In medieval Europe, labor rarely stopped. The sun marked the hours and the body obeyed. Even holy days, though free from certain work, often involved extra prayers or obligations. True leisure was rare, and idleness was scorned. Now picture yourself as a peasant, rising before dawn, hands numb with cold. You take the plow, heavy and crude, and drag it across the soil. Stones catch, roots tangle, your shoulders ache. By midday, you pause only briefly, bread and ale your simple meal, before work resumes. At dusk, your muscles burn, but still you must feed the animals, gather wood, and mend what is broken. Sleep comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. Or imagine yourself as an apprentice in town. Your master calls you before sunrise. You fetch water, stoke the fire, and polish tools. Hours stretch long as you hammer, sew, or carve, the work repetitive, the mistakes punished. You collapse into bed only to arise again at dawn, the cycle endless. This was the reality of medieval Europe. Work was the heartbeat of life, constant and unyielding. To live in such a world was to accept that every day would demand your body, your time, your strength. For us, a single week in such labor would feel like a lifetime. Our hands would blister, our backs would bend, our spirits would tire. But for them, it was simply life, carried forward by duty, necessity, and habit. So as you picture this world, hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of the plow, the murmur of prayers in the monastery. See the sweat on foreheads, the dirt on hands, the tired eyes at dusk. This was work in the Middle Ages. Endless, essential, and inescapable. If work was the rhythm of life in medieval Europe, sickness was its constant interruption. Illness lurked everywhere, within the food, the water, the air. To live in this world was to carry the fear of fever, wounds, and plague. Without modern hospitals, trained doctors, or reliable medicine, survival depended on luck, faith, and the strength of the body. To step into their world, even for a week, would mean facing diseases we rarely think about today, without the tools we now take for granted. Medicine in the Middle Ages was shaped less by science than by belief. The body was thought to be ruled by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping these humors in balance. Illness, then, was imbalance. To cure a sickness, one had to restore harmony through diet, herbs, bloodletting, or purging. The logic was not wholly irrational, but it was far from accurate, and often treatments did more harm than good. Imagine suffering from a fever. Instead of medicine to cool the body, you might be bled by leeches, your veins opened to release blood in the hope of balance. If your stomach ached, you might be given a bitter mixture of herbs or forced to vomit, in the belief that sickness must be expelled. If you had an infection, there were no antibiotics. Instead, a poultice of bread and herbs might be applied or prayers offered as the illness ran its course. Doctors did exist, but they were rare and costly. Trained in universities, they studied ancient texts from Galen and Hippocrates, writing prescriptions in Latin, often too expensive for common folk. Most peasants never saw a doctor. Their healers were local wise women, midwives, or monks who kept herb gardens. Remedies passed down by word and memory, shaped by trial and error.
Some were helpful. Garlic, honey, and certain herbs had real medicinal value. Others were superstition, such as charms against the evil eye or potions brewed beneath certain phases of the moon. Wounds were especially dangerous. A simple cut from a plow blade could fester, leading to infection. Without antiseptics, bacteria thrived. The skin reddened, pus formed, fever rose. Many such injuries ended in death. Broken bones, too, often healed poorly. Splints and bandages existed, but without surgical knowledge, bones might knit crookedly, leaving permanent pain or disability. Childbirth was perhaps the greatest danger of all. Women entered labor not with the promise of sterile rooms and trained doctors, but with only the help of midwives and prayer. Many mothers died from bleeding or infection, and many infants did not survive their first days. Life expectancy was shortened not just by disease, but by the hazards of birth itself. Then came the great waves of plague. The most famous, the Black Death of the 14th century, wiped out perhaps a third of Europe's population. It spread swiftly, carried by fleas on rats, leaving swollen buboes, high fever, and death within days. Entire villages were emptied, fields left untended, families broken apart. Imagine walking through a medieval street at that time. The smell of death in the air, carts carrying bodies, fear in every face. There was no cure, no prevention, no explanation beyond the wrath of God or poisoned air. Even outside such catastrophes, daily health was fragile. Malnutrition weakened the body. Diets and bread, pottage, and occasional meat provided just enough energy to work, but little protection against disease. Winters brought hunger, when stores ran low and the poor ate bark, acorns, or spoiled grain. Famine often led to illness, as weakened bodies succumbed to sickness more easily. Cleanliness was another challenge. Though some towns had public bathhouses and monasteries valued hygiene, most peasants washed rarely. Water was cold, soap scarce, and baths sometimes believed to spread illness rather than prevent it. Parasites, lice, fleas, and worms were common companions. Teeth rotted early, wounds stayed dirty, and infections spread without restraint. Mental health, too, was poorly understood. Madness, melancholy, or seizures were often seen as signs of possession or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from prayer and exorcism to crude physical remedies. Those who suffered might be cared for by family, hidden away, or cast out. The inner world of the mind had no place in medieval medicine, only mystery and fear. Think now of your own life. A headache might be eased with a pill. A cut is washed, cleaned, and bandaged. A fever is checked with a thermometer, and if severe, antibiotics or hospital care follow. In medieval Europe, each of these comforts was absent. A headache might be endured, a cut might fester, and a fever might mean death. Even the smallest ailments carried danger. Picture yourself as a peasant waking with a sharp pain in your side. Perhaps it is appendicitis. In today's world, surgery could save you. In theirs, it would mean agony, prayer, and almost certain death. Or imagine a child with a simple cough. Without medicine, the cough deepens, lungs fill with fluid, and life fades away. Illnesses we barely fear then could steal lives swiftly. And yet, amid all this fragility, people endured. Communities supported one another. Healers offered what wisdom they could, and faith provided comfort. The church saw illness as a trial, a path to humility and patience. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were made in search of cures. Relics, prayers, and blessings were believed to hold healing power. The body might suffer, but the soul could be strengthened. In monasteries, more careful healing took place. Monks tended herb gardens with plants like sage, rosemary, and lavender. They wrote medical texts, blending ancient knowledge with Christian teaching. Hospitals, in their earliest forms, arose from these religious houses, places not of cure, but of care, where the sick and dying could find food, shelter, and prayer. It was not medicine as we know it, but it was compassion. Still, for the traveler from our world to live even a week in theirs would be perilous. The air carried fevers, the water spread disease, the body weakened under hunger, and the cures often worsened the pain. To survive was not just to be strong, but to be fortunate. In that world, illness was always near, and health was only ever borrowed for a little while. So, as you imagine life in medieval Europe, see the healer mixing herbs, hear the prayer whispered over the sickbed, feel the fear of a cough or a cut. Medicine was hope stitched together with faith and tradition, fragile against the weight of disease. For us, a week would bring fear at every ache, dread at every fever. They lived with it always, and somehow they endured. In medieval Europe, law was less about fairness and more about order. The world was bound together by rules written, spoken, or simply remembered, and breaking them brought swift and often harsh punishment. To live in such a society was to walk always under the gaze of authority, whether lord, king, or church. For those used to modern courts, lawyers, and protections, surviving even a week beneath these laws would be a daunting trial. The roots of medieval law stretched back to a mix of traditions. Some came from Roman codes, preserved and reshaped. Others arose from local customs, spoken by elders and passed down in memory. The church, too, created its own laws, canon law, covering marriage, morality, and faith. Together, these strands wove a tangled system. Justice was not the same in every town or kingdom. What was legal in one place might be outlawed in another. At the heart of law stood the Lord. Within his manor, he judged disputes among his tenants. A man accused of stealing grain might be brought before him, neighbors testifying, the accused pleading. There were no lawyers, only words and witnesses. The Lord listened, weighed the matter, and declared the sentence. His word carried the force of law. In towns, officials called bailiffs or sheriffs performed similar roles, overseeing justice in the name of the crown. The church courts handled matters of the soul. If you broke an oath, failed to pay tithes, or lived in sin, it was the church that judged you. These courts were often less brutal than secular ones, but they carried great power. A sentence of penance, pilgrimage, or even excommunication could shape a life. To be cut off from the church was to be cut off from the community, a heavy punishment as heavy as any chain. Trials were rarely what we imagine today. Juries, when they appeared, were not groups of strangers carefully weighing evidence, but neighbors who already knew the accused and the accuser. Their role was less to debate guilt and more to confirm what was already suspected. In some places, older forms of trial still lingered. Ordeals meant to let God decide.
Punishment for crimes was harsh. For theft, a hand might be cut off. For repeated offenses, hanging awaited. Murder brought the gallows, though sometimes compensation,
called wergild, could be paid to the victim's family, depending on the law of the land. Lesser crimes brought fines, whippings, or time in the stocks, where the offender sat locked in public, mocked and pelted with refuse by neighbors. Execution itself was often a public spectacle. Hangings drew crowds, serving both as punishment and as warning. Some punishments were crueler still: beheadings for nobles, burning for heretics, or mutilations meant to mark a criminal forever. Justice was not gentle. It was designed to instill fear, to keep order in a world where authority was fragile and unrest always near. Yet the system was not only about punishment. Law also structured daily life. It governed marriage contracts, inheritance, land use, and market rules. If a man wished to marry, the church set conditions. If land passed from father to son, feudal law dictated who owed service to whom. In towns, guild rules ensured fair trade and quality goods. The web of law touched every corner of existence, guiding behavior as much as punishing it. Imagine, for a moment, finding yourself accused in this world. Perhaps a neighbor claims you stole his chicken. You are brought before the Lord, without lawyer or defense. The neighbors speak against you, and the Lord believes them. A fine is set, but you cannot pay. Stocks or whipping follow. Or worse, if the crime is judged severe, you face the gallows. There is no appeal, no higher court, no safeguard of rights. The law is the will of those in power, and you are subject to it. Even small missteps could bring danger. Speaking against a lord, failing to pay a tithe, breaking the Sabbath, all could be punished. The boundary between crime and sin was thin. To live safely was to obey not only the written rules, but also the unspoken expectations of community and church. Any act that set you apart risked suspicion, accusation, and trial. And yet, despite the harshness, law brought stability. In a world of uncertainty, with famine, war, and disease ever near, rules gave shape to life. People knew the boundaries, feared the punishments, and so kept the fragile peace. Without law, order might dissolve into chaos. Harsh justice was the price of survival. Now, consider your own world. If accused of a crime, you have the right to a lawyer, to a fair trial, to evidence carefully weighed. Punishment is restrained, rehabilitation often valued over cruelty. In medieval Europe, none of this existed. Justice was swift, rough, and final. For us, to endure even a week under such a system would be frightening. Every action would carry the risk of suspicion, every disagreement the chance of trial. Picture yourself walking in a medieval town. The stocks stand in the square, a man locked within, children throwing rotten fruit. A gallows rises on the hill, a grim reminder to all who pass. The air carries whispers of who was punished last, who faces trial next. It is a world where justice is not hidden behind court walls, but displayed openly, a warning carved into the lives of all who see. This was the law of the Middle Ages. Uneven, brutal, yet binding, it kept society in its fragile order, holding people together through fear, tradition, and faith. For us, it would be unbearable. A careless word, a false accusation, or a simple mistake might end in ruin. But for them, it was the fabric of life, woven into every day, every act, every breath. So, as you imagine yourself there, see the Lord upon his seat of judgment. Hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer mixing with the cry of the accused. Feel the heavy silence of a crowd watching punishment. The law was everywhere, unrelenting, a presence as constant as hunger or prayer. To survive beneath it was not just to obey, but to endure. In medieval Europe, society was not a flat landscape, but a towering ladder, each rung holding lives that rarely crossed. To be born on one step was to remain there for life.
Status, wealth, and opportunity were fixed as firmly as the stones of a castle wall. For someone from our modern world, where choice and mobility often seem natural, stepping into such a system would feel confining, even suffocating. But for the people of the Middle Ages, hierarchy was the order of the world, unquestioned and unshakable. At the top stood the king. He was the symbol of unity, the ruler by divine right, believed to hold his crown from God himself. His word could summon armies, his favor could grant land, and his displeasure could destroy families. Yet even the king was bound, for his power depended on the loyalty of the great lords beneath him. His throne rested on a fragile balance of promises and oaths. Beneath him came the nobility, lords, dukes, earls, and barons, each sworn to serve their king. In exchange for their loyalty and military service, they received vast estates, lands they ruled almost as little kingdoms of their own. From these lands came wealth, rents from peasants, harvests from fields, and soldiers in times of war. Nobles lived in castles or great manors, their lives filled with hunting, feasting, and politics. Yet their position was not simply privilege, it was also duty. They were expected to defend their lands, dispense justice, and uphold the order of feudal society. Below the nobility were the knights. These warriors were bound by the code of chivalry, sworn to protect their lords and the weak, though in reality they often served the demands of war and power more than ideals. Knights trained from boyhood, beginning as pages, then squires, before earning their spurs. Their armor, their horses, their weapons, all marked them as elite, yet their status was not as high as the great lords. They served, and in return, they received land or wealth to sustain their lives. The clergy formed another powerful class, separate but entwined with the nobility. Bishops, abbots, and priests held spiritual authority, guiding souls and shaping morality. The church owned vast lands, rivaling the wealth of kings. A peasant might never meet a noble lord, but he would know the parish priest, hear the bells of the church, and live beneath the shadow of the cross. The church was both refuge and ruler, offering salvation, but also demanding obedience. To defy it was to risk not only earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. And then came the common folk, the vast majority of people, peasants, laborers, artisans, those whose hands built the castles, plowed the fields, and wove the cloth. Most were serfs, bound to the land they worked. They could not freely leave, marry without permission, or own property in the way we understand it today. Their lives were tied to their lord's estate, generation after generation. Above them stood everyone else, and below them there was no one. In towns, a different structure took shape. Merchants, craftsmen, and guild members formed an emerging middle class, though far smaller than what we know today. Their wealth came from trade and skill rather than land, and they slowly began to reshape the balance of society. Yet even they remained beneath the nobility and clergy, their success limited by the boundaries of a rigid order. For women, hierarchy added another layer of inequality. A noblewoman might live in comfort, but her life was directed by father, husband, or son.
She managed the household, oversaw servants, and sometimes wielded influence in her husband's absence, but she rarely held power outright. Peasant women labored alongside their husbands in the fields, bore children, and kept households running, often with little recognition. The church taught obedience, humility, and silence, reinforcing a world where women's voices were rarely heard in public life. Inequality was not only between classes, but also within them. Among peasants, some families held more land, more tools, or more livestock. Among nobles, wealth and power varied widely, with some ruling vast regions and others holding only small manors. Yet all remained locked within the same order. Climbing higher was rare. A peasant might, through extraordinary service or fortune, become a knight. A talented merchant might rise in wealth and win favor with lords. A bright boy might join the church and become a bishop, but these were exceptions, rare enough to be remembered as tales, not common paths. Law and custom reinforced this structure. Sumptuary laws dictated what clothes each class could wear, ensuring that no peasant dressed like a noble, no merchant wore the silks of lords. Even language marked division. Nobles might speak French or Latin in courts, while peasants spoke local tongues in the fields. The world itself reminded everyone of their place, in clothing, speech, and daily duty. Imagine yourself in this world. If born a peasant, your future is already decided. You will work the fields, as your father did, as your children will. Ambition beyond survival is dangerous, even unthinkable. If born noble, you inherit wealth and land, but also duty and the constant threat of war. If born female, your role is set by the men in your life. There is little choice, little movement, little freedom. In our own world, the idea of climbing, of choosing one's path is central. Education, ambition, and opportunity allow movement, but in medieval Europe, the latter was fixed. To rebel against it was to rebel against the very order of the world, and rebellion rarely ended well. The hierarchy was not only political, but spiritual. The church taught that God had placed each man and woman in their station, and to question that was to question divine will. And yet, for all its inequality, this structure gave stability. Everyone knew their place, their duties, their obligations. The king ruled, the nobles defended, the clergy prayed, the peasants worked. It was a system that endured for centuries, shaping the rhythm of life as firmly as the seasons shaped the fields. For us, a week in such a world would feel confining. To be told that your birth alone defined your worth, that your clothing, your food, your very future were dictated by class, would be difficult to bear. But for them, it was life itself, unquestioned, accepted, and passed on. So as you picture medieval Europe, see the king upon his throne, the noble in his castle, the knight on his horse, the priest in his pulpit, and the peasant bent over his field. Hear the bells dividing the hours, the voices of lords in Latin, the chatter of villagers in their tongue. It is a world stacked high with inequality, held together by duty, belief, and fear. To survive in it is not to rise, but to remain where you were placed, enduring your place in the great chain of being. In medieval Europe, society was not a level field, but a pyramid, with a few standing tall at the top and countless others pressed beneath. To be born in this world was to inherit your place, for the hierarchy of the age was firm, deeply rooted, and seldom questioned. Today, we think of freedom of choice, of ambition, of paths we carve for ourselves. But in the Middle Ages, the rung on which you entered life's ladder was the rung where you remained, often until your final breath. At the very peak of this order stood the king. His crown was more than gold. It was a symbol of divine will. Kings ruled by the doctrine of divine right, believed to have been chosen by God to lead their people. Their authority was immense, but never absolute. They depended on alliances, oaths, and the loyalty of those just below them, the nobility. A king could summon armies and declare wars, but without his barons and lords, his commands could crumble into whispers. Power in the medieval world was always fragile, even at the highest throne. Beneath the king stretched the noble class, dukes, earls, counts, barons, and lords. These men and women were bound to the crown through feudal ties. They received vast estates in exchange for loyalty and military service. On their lands, they ruled as miniature sovereigns, dispensing justice, collecting rents, and leading men to battle. Nobles lived in stone castles and manors, symbols of strength and wealth. Yet their lives were not entirely lives of leisure. With power came responsibility, to defend their territories, to oversee peasants, and to balance the demands of king and church. Knights formed the next layer, men who devoted their lives to warfare and service. From a young age, boys of noble birth were trained first as pages, then as squires, until at last they could be dubbed knights. Their code, known as chivalry, promised loyalty, honor,
and defense of the weak, though reality often bent those ideals. Knights were marked by their horses, armor, and weapons, all expensive, all symbols of prestige. To see a knight riding through a village must have been awe-inspiring, his shining mail glittering in the sun, a reminder of both protection and oppression. The clergy, though not part of the feudal chain in a traditional sense, stood beside it with equal or greater influence. Bishops, abbots, priests, and monks guided the spiritual lives of the people while also controlling vast tracts of land. The church was not just a religious institution, but a landholder, a political force, and a guardian of knowledge. To the peasant, the parish priest was often the only educated figure they knew, the one who could read scripture, bless marriages, and pronounce penance. At the higher levels, bishops and abbots mingled with kings, shaping politics as much as souls. And then came the common folk, the peasants who tilled the soil, the artisans who made tools and cloth, the laborers whose backs bore the weight of castles and cathedrals. Within this group, the majority were serfs, legally bound to the land of their lord. They could not freely leave or sell their labor elsewhere. Their lives were shaped by endless work, modest meals, and obligations to both lord and church. Above them stretched layers of privilege they would never touch. For them, inequality was not an idea, it was the texture of daily life. In towns where trade flourished, a small middle class began to form. Merchants, craftsmen, and guild members who lived by skill and commerce rather than fields. Though they enjoyed more independence than peasants, they too lived under restrictions. Guilds dictated who could work, what could be sold, and at what price. Wealth did not easily erase class. A successful merchant might dress in finery, but laws often forbade him from wearing the silks or jewels reserved for nobles. The boundaries of hierarchy were not only guarded by tradition, but law itself.
Women carried yet another burden of inequality within this structure. For noble women, life meant managing estates in their husband's absence, overseeing servants and raising heirs, but rarely holding power in their own right. A few extraordinary women wielded influence, queens, abbesses, or regents, but they were exceptions, not the rule. For peasant women, the day was consumed by fieldwork, household tasks, and child-rearing. Their labor was constant, yet rarely acknowledged. The church preached obedience and silence, confining women to roles of service and submission. Inequality was stitched into the very fabric of society. It was seen not as injustice, but as natural order. The church taught of the great chain of being, a belief that God had arranged all creation in ranks, from angels to kings to peasants. To question this hierarchy was to question God's will. Thus, inequality was sanctified, made holy. A peasant who suffered hunger might be told his reward would come in heaven, while his lord's wealth was a divine trust. And yet, within this rigid system, small distinctions mattered. Among peasants, a family with 2 cows was wealthier than a neighbor with none. Among nobles, one baron might control dozens of villages while another ruled only a handful. Status was not entirely uniform, but still bound by the ladder of hierarchy. A few rare individuals climbed higher, a peasant knighted for service, a merchant gaining wealth enough to buy land, a scholar rising through the church to become bishop. But such stories were rare enough to be remembered as marvels, not expectations. Imagine yourself born into this world. If you opened your eyes in a peasant's hut, your life was already written. Days in the fields, nights by the fire, seasons of sowing and reaping, death likely near the same soil that gave you life. If you opened your eyes in a castle chamber, privilege surrounded you, but so too did duty, to fight, to marry strategically, to uphold your family's honor. If you were a woman, whether noble or peasant, your voice was limited, your choices narrowed, your fate entwined with the men of your kin. Compared to today, where we often believe effort or talent can carry us upward, the medieval hierarchy feels suffocating. There were no ladders of opportunity, no broad avenues of change. Class was destiny, And inequality was not just accepted, but expected. It gave the world order, yes, but it also gave it rigidity. Still, for all its strictness, this hierarchy endured because it created stability. Each person knew their role, their obligations, their place in the order of things. Kings ruled, nobles defended, clergy prayed, peasants labored. The world turned upon this structure as surely as it turned upon the seasons. To survive in it meant not to dream of rising higher, but to endure where you were placed, finding meaning in the duties of your station. So as you picture medieval Europe, see the layers of its society stacked high. The king upon his throne, the noble in his hall, the knight in his armor, the priest in his robes, and the peasant bent in his field. Hear the bells of the church dividing the day, the rustle of silk on noble shoulders, the creak of wooden carts in muddy lanes. It is a world of sharp divisions, a world where inequality was woven into life itself. To live in it, even for a week, would be to accept chains both visible and unseen. To step into the world of medieval Europe is to step into a world constantly shadowed by war. Warfare was not a distant event or something you might only read about in news or history books like we do today. For medieval men, women, and children, it was a recurring reality, sometimes distant, sometimes pressing at the very gates of their village, and always present in memory and rumor. The dangers of war were not confined to the battlefield, but spread far and wide, shaping every life that lay beneath the banners of kings and lords. When armies marched, they brought with them not only steel and horses, but also hunger, disease, and destruction. For the common peasant, the sound of drums and the sight of armed men on the horizon did not mean noble causes or heroic deeds. It meant crops trampled, livestock stolen, homes set alight, and the terror of fleeing into forests to escape violence. Warfare was never clean. It was a storm that consumed all in its path, and those without armor suffered most. The battlefield itself was a place of unimaginable danger. Today, we might imagine soldiers clashing in dramatic duels, but the reality was chaos. Imagine the ground shaking beneath the charge of war horses, lances lowered, the crash of wood and iron splintering against shields. Picture the clash of swords, the press of bodies, the mud made slick not only with water, but with blood. Soldiers fought in armor that was heavy, suffocating, and exhausting. Even the most skilled knight risked being unhorsed, trampled, or crushed beneath the melee. Victory did not guarantee survival, for wounds easily turned to infections, often fatal in an age without antibiotics. Weapons themselves carried their own horrors. The longbow with its deadly range could pierce through armor, cutting down men before they even reached the fight. Crossbow bolts struck with terrifying force, leaving wounds that could rarely be healed. Swords, axes, and maces inflicted injuries gruesome and lasting. But perhaps the greatest terror was not death in the heat of combat, but what followed. The wounded left groaning on the field, many abandoned to die alone, prey to scavengers, or taken as prisoners of war with uncertain fates. Siege warfare added another layer of danger and despair. Castles and fortified towns might hold out for weeks or months under siege. Within the walls, hunger gnawed at defenders, water supplies dried up, and disease spread in the cramped quarters. Outside, attackers built siege towers, catapults, and trebuchets, hurling massive stones, fire, or even rotting carcasses to break both walls and morale. To live through a siege was to live through terror, the constant fear that one's defenses might crumble and the enemy would pour in with sword and torch. For those not directly fighting, the dangers were just as real. Armies, whether victors or losers, often looted the lands they passed through. Villages could be burned as warnings, crops seized to feed soldiers, and peasants dragged away as laborers or worse. Women and children were especially vulnerable, caught in the path of violence without protection.
In many ways, war turned ordinary life into something fragile, easily broken, easily lost. Even the nobility, who commanded armies and wore armor of steel, were not immune to danger. A nobleman might ride into battle with banners flying, yet one unlucky blow could end his life. Captivity was sometimes worse than death. Captured nobles were ransomed back to their families at ruinous costs, their lands often stripped or raided while they were held. To fight in medieval war was to gamble not only with one's life, but with one's family's fortunes and legacy. Disease followed war as faithfully as soldiers did. Camps of thousands of men living in poor conditions became breeding grounds for sickness. Dysentery, typhoid, and plague often killed more than swords and arrows. In some campaigns, armies dwindled to half their size, not from fighting, but from illness. The same disease spread to nearby towns, ensuring that civilians paid the price of war long after the armies marched on. The psychological dangers were also immense. Today we speak of trauma and the lasting scars of violence.
In the Middle Ages, such words did not exist, yet the experiences were no less real. Soldiers carried the memory of screams and blood, the sight of friends falling beside them, the dread of never knowing if the next blow would be theirs. Villagers carried the memory of fire consuming their homes, of families scattered or lost. Fear was a constant shadow, passed on in stories whispered by firelight, never forgotten. Even in times of so-called peace, the threat of war lingered. Borders were never secure, rival lords quarreled over land, and kings fought endless campaigns to expand or defend their territories. A poor harvest could spark rebellion. A disputed succession could plunge a kingdom into civil war. For ordinary people, life was lived beneath the uncertainty that tomorrow's dawn might bring soldiers to their fields. The dangers of warfare were not only physical, but moral. Chivalry spoke of honor and noble conduct, but war often stripped those ideals away. Raiding, pillaging, and cruelty were common. The line between survival and savagery blurred. To protect one's own sometimes meant harming another without mercy. Thus, war did not only threaten bodies, it threatened souls, testing the faith and humanity of all caught within its grasp. So imagine, if you will, stepping into this world. You are no longer a modern traveler with a safe home to return to. You are a villager, hearing rumors of an approaching army. You hide what little grain you have, herd your family into the woods, and hope the soldiers pass by. Or perhaps you are a knight, tightening your armor, knowing the next dawn may bring battle, knowing that one mistake could end not just your life, but your family's legacy. The dangers of warfare were inescapable. To live even a week in this world was to live under the shadow of violence, where safety was never assured and peace was often no more than a fragile pause before the next storm. To live in medieval Europe was to live beneath a system of law that was at once simple and severe. Unlike today, where justice is often slow and layered with appeals and protections, medieval justice was swift, public, and terrifying. It was designed not so much to reform the guilty as to warn the rest. For ordinary men and women, the law was not an abstract idea, but a looming shadow, one misstep away from humiliation, pain, or death. At the heart of medieval justice lay the belief that order must be maintained at all costs. Life was fragile, kingdoms were unstable, and survival depended on obedience. Thus, even the smallest of crimes could bring harsh punishments. Steal a loaf of bread, and you might find yourself beaten, branded, or locked in the stocks for the village to jeer at. Speak against your lord or your king, and you risked far worse: imprisonment in a dungeon, mutilation, or execution. The law was not blind. It was weighted heavily in favor of the powerful, and the poor bore its punishments most keenly. The courts themselves varied widely. In villages, manorial courts handled disputes over land, labor, and small thefts. In towns, guild courts or civic authorities might preside.
The church, too, held immense judicial power, with ecclesiastical courts that judged cases of morality, heresy, and clerical misconduct. Justice was fragmented, and outcomes could depend more on status and influence than on truth. A nobleman might escape with a fine, where a peasant faced whipping. Yet both lived under the constant reminder that authority had the right to decide their fate. Punishments were designed to be seen. Public humiliation was one of the most common tools. Stocks and pillories were placed in village squares, where the guilty were fastened by head, hands, or feet for hours or days. Passers-by were encouraged to mock, to throw rotten vegetables, to jeer until the prisoner's shame was complete. The pain was real, but the humiliation was often worse. A man once respected could leave the stocks broken, his reputation in tatters, his life forever altered. For more serious crimes, the punishments grew harsher. Thieves might lose a hand, poachers their ears. Branding with hot irons marked criminals permanently, a visible scar of dishonor. Execution was always possible, for murder, for treason, for heresy. But it was also theatrical. Hangings drew large crowds, serving as grim reminders of the law's power. In some places, traitors were beheaded, their heads displayed on spikes at city gates. These gruesome sights were not meant only to kill the guilty, but to speak to the living. Defy the law, and this could be you. Fear of punishment reached into every corner of daily life. In towns, curfews were enforced, and strangers viewed with suspicion. A man traveling without proper documents might be questioned, detained, or accused of vagrancy. In villages, disputes between neighbors could end in the courtroom, and gossip alone could lead to accusation. The uncertainty was constant. One day you might be free, the next dragged before a lord or magistrate with little chance to defend yourself. The role of the church in justice added another layer of fear. Heresy was considered not only a crime, but a mortal danger to the soul and the community. To question the teachings of the church, to practice strange beliefs, or even to speak unwisely could lead to accusations. Trials for heresy were severe, often involving torture to extract confessions. Punishments ranged from penance to imprisonment, and at worst, burning at the stake. The fire that consumed the condemned was meant not only to destroy the body, but to cleanse the soul, at least in the eyes of the faithful. Torture itself was a grim feature of medieval justice, though not as constant as popular imagination suggests. Devices such as the rack, the thumbscrew, or the iron boot were sometimes used to force confessions. The idea was not merely cruelty, but the belief that truth could be forced from the body when words failed. For those subjected to it, the pain was unimaginable, and survival often worse than death. The knowledge that such measures existed cast a shadow of dread over anyone accused, guilty or not. Yet, justice in the Middle Ages was not only about cruelty. Sometimes it was surprisingly practical. Compensation was common for lesser disputes, with fines paid in goods or coin. Oaths and witness testimony carried weight, with the accused swearing innocence before God and neighbors. In some regions, trial by ordeal was practiced, plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying a hot iron. If the wound healed cleanly, God was believed to have judged the accused innocent. Such trials were terrifying, but they reflected a world where divine will was inseparable from law. The psychological weight of punishment cannot be overstated. Children grew up watching men whipped, women scolded in public, thieves hanging on the gallows. Fear was a teacher, shaping behavior long before courts became involved. Parents warned their children with stories of punishments, and communities learned to regulate themselves through shame and suspicion. Justice was not just imposed from above, it was internalized, carried in the minds of the people. Imagine yourself in this world. You walk through a village square and see a man locked in the stocks, his face red with shame as children throw mud at him. You pass a city gate where the head of a trader darkens in the sun, birds circling above. You hear whispers of a woman accused of witchcraft, her fate uncertain, her neighbors fearful of guilt by association. The law is not distant, it is everywhere, always present, always watching. Compared to modern systems, medieval justice feels harsh, even brutal, but in a world where survival depended on order, where kings feared rebellion and lords feared unrest, severity was thought necessary. It kept the peace, however grimly. For the medieval person, justice was not about fairness as we see it today, but about stability. Better that one suffer publicly, they believed, than many suffer chaos. And so, justice in the Middle Ages was never gentle. It was harsh for small crimes, merciless for great ones, and terrifying for all who lived under its gaze. To survive in this world was not only to avoid hunger or war, but to avoid the misstep that might place you in the stocks, the dungeon, or the gallows. Fear was the greatest law of all, and it kept medieval towns and villages in uneasy order. When we think of childhood today, we imagine play, school, and years of learning before the responsibilities of adult life arrive. In medieval Europe, childhood was something altogether different. It was brief, fragile, and overshadowed by labor, duty, and survival. To be born in this world was to step immediately into uncertainty. Many children did not live long enough to see adulthood, and those who did often entered work before they could read or write a single word. Childhood was not a sanctuary, but the first stage in a hard and narrow life. From the moment of birth, danger surrounded the medieval child. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high. Illness, poor nutrition, and a lack of medical knowledge meant that as many as half of all children never lived beyond their first few years. A fever, a difficult birth, or even something as simple as bad water could claim a young life. Parents, though loving, knew this reality well. The grief of losing children was common, and yet life forced families to move forward, to bear more children and to hope that some would survive. For those who lived past infancy, work began early. A child of a peasant family would soon find themselves helping in the fields, carrying water, tending animals, or assisting with household tasks. There was little time for games, though children did sometimes play with simple toys. Wooden dolls, hoops, or carved figures. Play existed, but it was scattered between chores and duties. A boy of 7 might already herd sheep, while a girl of the same age might care for younger siblings or help prepare meals. Childhood was not a time of preparation for adulthood, it was already part of it. Education, as we think of it today, was the privilege of the very few. Most children never saw a schoolroom or a book. Literacy was rare, and for peasants, unnecessary. Survival did not depend on reading, but on labor. Knowledge was passed through experience, through watching parents and elders, through learning how to plant, to weave, to cook, to mend. Skills mattered more than letters, and wisdom was measured by what one could do, not by what one could read. The church was the chief gateway to education. Monasteries and cathedral schools taught Latin, scripture, and the skills of writing and copying texts. But these were not places for peasant children. They were reserved mostly for boys of noble birth or for those whose families could afford to dedicate a child to the church. To be educated was often to be set apart from the world of fields and villages, drawn instead into the life of priests, monks, or clerks. For such children, books and parchments replaced plows and tools, though their paths were just as rigidly bound by duty. Noble children lived differently, though not without their own burdens. Sons of lords might be sent away at a young age to train as pages in another noble household. There they would learn manners, horsemanship, hunting, and the first lessons of warfare. By adolescence they would serve as squires, assisting knights and preparing for the day they themselves would ride into battle. Their education was not in letters, but in loyalty and arms. Noble daughters, on the other hand, were often taught the arts of household management, how to run an estate, direct servants, weave fine cloth, and sometimes read prayers or keep simple accounts. Their futures were tied to marriage and alliance, and their education reflected that destiny. For townsfolk, opportunities were slightly broader.
Merchant families sometimes taught their children to read, write, and calculate, since trade demanded it. Guilds also played a role, taking in boys as apprentices and training them in specific crafts, smithing, weaving, carpentry. But apprenticeships were less about schooling than about years of hard labor in exchange for skill. Education, when it appeared, was always tied to usefulness. Knowledge for its own sake was a rare luxury, reserved for scholars, clerics, and a handful of the wealthy. The gulf between those who learned letters and those who did not was vast. To read in the Middle Ages was to hold a kind of power, a privilege that marked one as different. A literate person could access scripture directly, record transactions, or correspond across distances. But most relied on others to speak and interpret for them. In this way, education was another form of inequality, reinforcing the hierarchies that shaped every aspect of medieval life. Childhood itself was shorter than we imagine today. By 12 or 13, many children were already considered young adults. Peasant boys worked as men in the fields. Girls were married as soon as they could bear children. The line between childhood and adulthood blurred quickly, sometimes disappearing altogether. Responsibility was thrust upon the young, not as a choice, but as a necessity. And yet, despite hardship, children were not without joy. They laughed, played when they could, and found wonder in the world around them. Festivals offered moments of delight with songs, dancing, and treats. Village games, simple toys, and the companionship of other children brought brief escapes from toil. Their lives were not only struggle, but whatever joys existed were fleeting, woven into the fabric of labor and survival. To imagine yourself as a medieval child is to imagine a life far from the classrooms and playgrounds we know today. You might rise at dawn to tend geese, your hands raw from cold water. You might kneel by your mother as she spins wool, learning the rhythm of her hands. Or if you were born into privilege, you might practice your letters by candlelight, reciting Latin prayers while dreaming of knighthood or marriage. No matter your station, your path was narrow, your choices few, your childhood brief. Compared to our world, the difference is striking. Today, childhood is guarded. Education is nearly universal, and children are given years to grow before stepping into adult roles. In the medieval age, there was no such protection. Childhood was a fragile passage, easily cut short by death, work, or duty. Education was a rare treasure, held tightly by the few. And so most children lived not in the world of books and lessons, but in the world of chores, fields, and survival.
Thus, when we look back at childhood in the medieval world, we see both resilience and tragedy. We see children laughing in the fields even as they labor, families hoping desperately for survival, and the rare scholar child bent over a parchment. It is a reminder of how precious our modern childhoods are and how harsh the past once was. To survive in such a world was no easy feat, and to grow from child to adult was itself a victory over countless dangers. To understand life in medieval Europe, one must look closely at the lives of women. They formed the heart of households, the backbone of villages, and the often unseen strength of noble estates. Yet their work, their struggles, and their resilience were rarely celebrated in the chronicles of kings or the songs of knights. Women's lives were demanding, often dangerous, and deeply bound to the rhythms of labor, childbirth, and duty. Still, within those constraints, women created meaning, nurtured families, and held their communities together. For most women, daily life was defined by household labor. At dawn, when roosters called and the first light touched the fields, peasant women were already at work. They stoked hearths, prepared simple meals, and set their children to tasks. They tended chickens and pigs, gathered firewood, and fetched water from wells or streams. The work was constant and rarely easy. Cooking itself was laborious. Grains boiled into pottage, bread baked in heavy ovens, and meats preserved through salting or smoking. Every task demanded time, skill, and strength. Beyond the household, women's labor extended into the fields. A peasant woman was not only a mother or homemaker, but also a farmer's partner. She sowed seeds, weeded crops, and helped with harvests. She carried baskets of hay, mended tools, and sometimes worked alongside men in grueling tasks like threshing grain. In times of hardship, when famine or war thinned the workforce, women stepped into every role necessary for survival. Their contribution was indispensable, though it often went unrecognized by law or record. Weaving and spinning formed another cornerstone of women's labor. With wool, flax, or hemp, women spun threads, wove cloth, and produced garments for their families. Clothing was not bought, but made, and each stage, from carding fibers to sewing tunics, fell largely to women's hands. In noble households, women oversaw entire rooms of spinners and weavers, their management ensuring both warmth for their family and status through fine fabrics. In peasant homes, weaving was humbler, but no less vital, keeping children clothed through bitter winters. Childbearing was perhaps the greatest trial faced by medieval women. Pregnancy was common, but safety was never guaranteed. Poor medical knowledge, lack of hygiene, and the absence of effective treatments meant that childbirth carried enormous risks. Many women died in labor, and many infants did not survive their first days. Even those who lived carried the scars of repeated pregnancies and the wear of hard labor on their bodies. The Church praised motherhood as a sacred duty, but the cost was often measured in women's health and lives. To be a woman in the Middle Ages was to face the constant shadow of loss of children, loss of strength, and sometimes loss of one's own life in the act of giving life. Yet women's lives were not only hardship, they were also sources of resilience, creativity, and quiet authority. Peasant women kept families alive through famine, stretching food supplies with ingenuity. They held knowledge of herbs and remedies, tending the sick when physicians were distant or unaffordable. They managed households with skill, balancing meager resources to ensure survival. Their endurance was an inheritance passed from mother to daughter, shaping generations who endured despite the odds. For noble women, life carried different forms of responsibility. While they were spared the daily toil of farming, their roles were far from idle. Noble women managed estates, especially in the absence of husbands who rode to war or court. They oversaw servants, supervised food supplies, arranged marriages for their children, and kept records of estate accounts. Some noble women acted as regents, wielding real political authority on behalf of young heirs. Though bound by expectations of obedience, they often proved capable rulers, keeping lands prosperous and households stable. Marriage defined much of a woman's life, regardless of class. Peasant women married young, often in their teens, and quickly assumed the duties of wife and mother. Noble women's marriages were arranged, sealed for alliances and property rather than affection. Yet within these bonds, women found ways to exercise influence through household management, the raising of children, and the shaping of family traditions. Marriage was not always kind, but it was the framework within which women lived, worked, and endured. Religion, too, shaped women's lives deeply. The Church prescribed obedience, modesty, and silence, holding up the Virgin Mary as the model of purity and devotion. Yet the Church also offered women a path beyond marriage and motherhood, the convent. For some, entering a convent meant safety from forced marriage or a chance to pursue learning and spiritual authority. Nuns copied manuscripts, taught girls, tended the sick, and sometimes influenced politics through their abbeys. Though still bound by restrictions, these women carved out spaces of agency and purpose in a world that often denied them. It is important, too, to see the bonds between women. In villages, women worked side by side in fields, kitchens, and markets.
They shared remedies and helped raise each other's children. In noble households, women collaborated to manage estates, weaving networks of influence. Though their contributions were often hidden from formal records, these relationships sustained communities through hardship. To imagine yourself as a woman in the Middle Ages is to imagine a life of endless motion. Your hands never idle, always kneading dough, spinning wool, carrying water, or tending to children. You rise before the sun and sleep long after it sets, your body weary, but your work unfinished. If noble, your tasks are different, but no less consuming. Balancing accounts, organizing servants, writing letters, and maintaining the reputation of your family. At every level, life demanded strength, skill, and endurance. Yet, within these challenges, medieval women left their mark. They preserved knowledge, nurtured families, managed lands, and held communities together. Their names may not fill the pages of chronicles, but their labor built the very foundation upon which kingdoms rested. Without their work, the medieval world could not have survived. When we reflect on women's lives in the Middle Ages, we must do so with both honesty and respect. Their lives were hard, their risks many, and their freedoms few, but they were not passive. They were resilient, resourceful, and central to the life of their time. Their strength was not sung by troubadours or etched into chronicles, but it was felt in every hearth that warmed a family, every field that yielded food, and every child who grew to adulthood under their care. To survive as a woman in medieval Europe was no small feat. It demanded patience, endurance, and courage. And though their voices are faint in history, their resilience echoes still, reminding us that even in the harshest times, human strength and care endured.
As our journey through medieval Europe comes to a close, let us pause and imagine for just a moment what it would truly mean to spend 1 week there. We have walked through the cobblestone streets of towns, wandered into smoky huts, stepped through castle gates, and stood in the shadow of plague, war, and famine. We have heard the clamor of markets, smelled the smoke of hearths, and felt the weary weight of endless labor. And now, in the quiet of reflection, we gather those impressions together. What would life be like if you were placed suddenly into that world? Could you endure a week? Or would the burdens of medieval existence weigh too heavily to bear? Let us retrace the days, slowly and gently, as though drifting backward in a dream. Day 1. Arrival in a different world. Your first day would be a shock. The journey itself would test you. Roads were muddy, rutted, and slow. Carriages jolted painfully, horses labored, and travelers walked for hours to cover a distance we now glide across in minutes. Dust and cold air would cling to you, while strangers on the road, pilgrims, traders, or soldiers, might bring not comfort, but unease. Arriving in a village, you would not be welcomed into cozy rooms or warm beds. Instead, you might sleep on straw, sharing space with animals, the smell of smoke, and the constant bite of chill air. Day 2. The taste of survival. Food, once a comfort, would quickly become a test. Instead of coffee or tea, your morning would begin with coarse bread, perhaps dipped into ale or thin broth. Vegetables and grains filled most meals, meat appearing only occasionally. For peasants, variety was rare. Hunger was frequent. You might find yourself chewing hard crusts of bread, drinking water that carried the taste of earth or disease, and missing the abundance of fruits, spices, and sweetness that fill modern tables. Eating was survival, not indulgence, and every bite reminded you of the fragile line between plenty and hunger. Day 3. The weight of work. By your third day, labor would set in. For a peasant, dawn meant work that stretched until dusk. You would carry water, chop wood, tend to animals, or bend for hours in fields. The body, unaccustomed to such strain, would ache under the endless rhythm of toil. If you were noble, your duties would be different: managing estates, overseeing servants, or ensuring accounts were kept. Yet even this life was not restful. Every role demanded vigilance, responsibility, and often worry. The rhythm of medieval labor was relentless. Work was not a part of life, it was life. Day 4. The strain of hygiene and health. Hygiene, by modern standards, would feel unbearable. Bathing was rare, water often unsafe, and streets carried the stench of waste. Vermin crawled easily into beds, and lice infested hair and clothing. For a modern visitor, this constant discomfort would be overwhelming. Worse still, health was fragile. A small wound could fester into infection. A fever might be deadly. And in the distance, the shadow of plague lingered, an invisible threat capable of emptying entire villages. In such a world, every cough carried fear, every sickness carried weight, and safety was never certain. Day 5. The presence of danger. By your 5th day, you would feel the presence of danger all around. Warfare scarred the landscape, knights and mercenaries clashed, and villages were burned or plundered. Even without battle, justice itself was harsh. For a small crime, one might face public humiliation, whipping, or even execution. Imagine walking through a town square and seeing stocks occupied, or hearing the hush of a crowd as punishment was carried out. Fear was part of daily life, not the fear of rare disasters, but of ordinary, ever-present dangers. Day 6. The burden of expectation. For women especially, the 6th day would be shaped by duty. A peasant woman would rise to work both home and field, bearing children while carrying water and tending fires. A noble woman, though spared physical toil, carried the burden of managing estates, arranging alliances, and representing her family's honor. Everywhere, expectations pressed upon shoulders. Men, women, and children all had their roles, and stepping outside them brought risk. Individual freedom, as we understand it today, was not the measure of life. Survival, duty, and reputation were. And so, by the 7th day, you would feel a deep weariness. Your body sore, your senses overwhelmed, your spirit longing for the comforts of home. The hardship of food, the strain of labor, the dangers of disease, the fear of punishment, all would weigh heavily. It is likely that after a single week, you would long desperately to return to the present, to warmth, to safety, to abundance. Why we wouldn't last? When we ask, why couldn't we survive a week in medieval Europe, the answer lies not only in the harshness of their world, but in our own softness. We are accustomed to comforts they could not imagine: warm showers, clean water, medicine, variety in food, freedom of movement, and protection under laws. To them, hardship was normal. To us, it would be unendurable. It is not weakness to admit this, it is simply truth. We belong to our own time, shaped by its blessings and its expectations. To step back into the Middle Ages would not only be uncomfortable, it would be nearly impossible. And a gentle closing. And yet, as we reflect, let us not leave with fear, but with gratitude. For though life in medieval Europe was filled with dangers, it was also filled with resilience. Men and women endured, worked, and built, generation after generation, until their world gave way to ours. Without their endurance, there would be no present comfort for us to cherish. So, as we close this journey, let us breathe deeply,
Let us remember the smoke-filled halls, the cobblestones underfoot, the endless labor of hands long gone, and then let us return to the present moment, the warmth of a bed, the safety of medicine, the ease of clean water and nourishing food. We could not last a week in their world, but they lasted lifetimes. And tonight, as you drift into rest, may you carry with you both the memory of their endurance and the gratitude for your own. The past is behind us. The present holds us. And in this gentle reflection, may you find calm, peace, and sleep.